My name is Marcus. I'm 31, and my life is rooted in a small city across the water from Seattle. It's a place defined by the grey mist of the Puget Sound and the steady rhythm of the ferry schedule. I keep to myself, renting a small loft apartment over a vintage guitar shop where I work as a luthier, mending cracked wood and coaxing life back into old instruments. It's a quiet, solitary craft, fixing broken things. It doesn't bring in a lot of money, but it covers my rent and allows me to work with my hands. I've never been one for big crowds or loud conversations. I've never really been in a serious relationship either. I suppose I always assumed that part of life would sort itself out eventually, but eventually seemed to be permanently delayed. The majority of my mornings followed an unchangeable script. I would walk the 3 blocks from my apartment to a little bookstore cafe called The Daily Grind, order a large Earl Grey tea with honey, and head to the workshop. It was the same time, the same order, every single day. And every single day, the same woman was working the counter. Her name was Clara, and she looked to be a few years older than me. She had pale blonde hair she always kept pulled back in a messy bun, a constellation of light freckles across her nose, and she favored soft, worn-out sweaters in shades of grey and blue. She never offered a manufactured smile. If she smiled, it was because something was genuinely amusing. There was nothing artificial about her. Her voice carried a low, wry humour that could make you laugh before you even processed the joke. But my interactions with her were minimal. "Large Earl Grey, honey, thanks." That was the extent of it. For all I knew, I was just another face in the morning rush, completely unmemorable. Then, one rainy Thursday morning around 10, I was running later than usual and grabbed my tea to go, just like always. I got to my first client's house, a musician needing a refret on his prized acoustic, and reached into my bag for my specialized fret-pulling tool. It wasn't there. I mentally retraced my steps. The only place I could have left it was on the counter at the bookstore. A knot of anxiety tightened in my stomach. That tool was custom-made and irreplaceable. I rushed back, but it wasn't on the counter where I'd paid. I asked the young man now at the register, but he just gave me a blank stare. He mentioned that Clara had stepped out to run an errand, which seemed odd. Baristas didn't typically leave in the middle of a busy morning shift. I resigned myself to checking back later, but I wouldn't need to. About an hour later, as I was standing in the doorway of my workshop, trying to figure out how to proceed without my essential equipment, a well-worn Subaru Forester pulled up to the curb. Clara got out, holding my tool in her hand. "I think you lost this," she said, offering a small, hesitant wave. I was completely floored. "How did you even—" "Your shop's logo is on your jacket," she explained, gesturing to my work coat. A little online search did the rest. She passed it to me, and I was so taken aback I almost fumbled the handoff. "You drove all the way over here just to bring this back?" I asked, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. She gave a slight shrug, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I figured it was important. Plus," she added with a faint smile, "I was curious to see the workshop of the guy who orders Earl Grey with honey every morning." A small, awkward laugh escaped me, but it felt real. "You notice that?" She tilted her head, her gaze direct. "Of course. You come in every day at 9:15, sharp. I notice all my regulars. But you're always so quiet. It's a little mysterious." I could feel a warmth spreading up my neck. "I'm, not much of a morning person." She smiled then, a genuine, unguarded smile, and for a brief moment the air between us seemed to change, to thicken with unspoken possibility. "Well," she said, "you've now said more to me in the last 5 minutes than you have in the past year. I suppose that makes us acquaintances now." The statement caught me by surprise. I let out another nervous chuckle. Yeah, I guess it does. She nodded. All right, mystery man. Try not to lose your tools again. With that, she got back into her car and drove away. I just stood there on the sidewalk, the cold metal of the tool in my hand, my heart performing a strange, unfamiliar rhythm in my chest. For the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel like an invisible man drifting through the scenes of my own life. I had no idea what to do with that sensation, but I knew one thing for certain. That morning, when she pulled up in her old Subaru and smiled at me, was the first moment I had felt a flicker of something truly alive. That night, sleep was impossible. It wasn't anxiety or stress keeping me awake, but the constant replay of those few minutes in front of my workshop, the sound of her voice, the dry wit in her tone, the brief, intriguing spark in her eyes. I think that was the beginning of it all. It wasn't love, not then. But it was like a hairline crack had formed in the solitary world I had built for myself. For the first time, I felt a pull to show up for something more than just my daily cup of tea. I wanted to show up for her. In the days that followed Clara returning my tool, I was a mess. Every time I walked into that bookstore, my legs felt unsteady, and my voice would get stuck in my throat before I could even place my order. And she, in her own subtle way, didn't make it any easier. She began to speak to me as if we were actual friends. It wasn't some loud, effusive greeting, but a quiet, familiar acknowledgement, the kind you'd give someone you'd known for ages. Morning 9:15. She'd say with a small smirk as I approached the counter, my mind still foggy with sleep and social awkwardness. I'd manage a smile in return. Some days I'd offer a mumbled reply. On other days, I'd just stand there, looking at her as if I'd completely forgotten why I'd come in. But gradually, very gradually, my courage began to build. I started responding with more than just a simple thanks. One afternoon, I saw her restocking a shelf of novels and asked, "Do you ever get tired of being in here?" She glanced up, a book in her hand. "Every single day. But I've also got rent to pay and a 7-year-old who thinks chicken nuggets are a food group. So this is it." I was quiet for a beat, processing the new information. "You have a son?" She nodded, her expression unreadable. "Yep, Leo, he's in 2nd grade. He's obsessed with space and allergic to cleaning his room. What about you? Got a secret family stashed away somewhere?" I laughed, a real laugh this time. "No, just me. Never really found the time to start a family." "There's still time," she said softly, turning back to the shelf. That simple phrase echoed in my mind for the rest of the day. Over the next several weeks, this became our new routine. I'd come in for my tea and we would talk about anything and everything. Her favorite authors, the strange requests I got from clients, the time she tried to bake a birthday cake from scratch and nearly set her kitchen on fire. She told stories with an easy grace, as if she was completely unconcerned with being judged. And the more I listened, the more I began to sense a deep well of weariness beneath her witty exterior. She never said it directly, but I could see it in her eyes when she mentioned her ex. I could hear it in the slight hesitation before she spoke of her past. She wasn't broken, just carrying something heavy. I never tried to pry or offer solutions. I wasn't her hero, but I kept showing up. Sometimes I'd leave little doodles on a napkin for her, a sketch of a guitar or a cartoon of a grumpy-looking coffee bean. She'd roll her eyes playfully, but I had a feeling she smiled after I had left. Then one Friday, things felt different. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the street, and I was walking home after a long day at the shop when I saw her locking the front door of the bookstore. I hesitated on the opposite curb, then took a breath and crossed the street. "Hey," I said. She turned, a hint of surprise on her face. "Marcus, it's past your bedtime." I smiled. "Just wrapped up at work." She jingled her keys in her hand, not seeming to be in any particular hurry. Want to walk for a bit? I'm not really in the mood to go straight home. I didn't have to think about it. Yeah, of course. We walked in comfortable silence at first, the only sounds being the soft scuff of her boots and my sneakers on the pavement. After a few blocks, she gestured toward a house that still had its holiday lights up, even though it was already April. Some people have a hard time letting go, she murmured. I glanced at her profile, wondering if she was talking about more than just the lights. Do you miss him? I asked, my voice softer than I intended. She didn't reply immediately. I miss the person I thought he was, she said finally. The version of him I made up in my head, not the man he actually is. We continued walking until we reached a small waterfront park with a solitary wooden bench overlooking the Sound. She sat down, and I joined her. She pulled a small, dented thermos from her tote bag. Want some tea? It's probably lukewarm by now. I nodded. Sure. We drank in silence, listening to the cry of a distant gull. Then, so quietly I almost missed it, she said, You're different. Different in what way? I asked. You don't seem to want anything from me, she explained. You're just present. I don't think I've ever really had that before. My heart started to hammer against my ribs. It wasn't like a scene from a movie. It was a physical, visceral reaction, my body sensing that I was on the verge of doing something irreversible. I turned to face her fully. She met my gaze and didn't look away. And before my rational mind could intervene, I heard myself ask, What would you do if I kissed you right now? There was a fractional pause, a space of pure silence. Then a small, real smile touched her lips. She leaned in, not all the way, but just enough for me to feel the warmth of her breath. Find out, she whispered. So I did. There were no fireworks, no swelling orchestra. It wasn't cinematic, it was real. Her lips were soft, but there was a deep sadness in the kiss, a hesitance as if she'd been down this road before and wasn't sure she wanted to unlock that door again. When we finally pulled apart, she just looked at me, her eyes searching mine for a long moment. I had no idea what to say. I just stared back. Finally, she spoke. I haven't done that in a very long time. Me neither, I confessed. She stood up abruptly. I should get home to Leo. I nodded, my mind reeling. We didn't hug. We didn't make any promises for the future. She just offered a tired but warm smile and walked away into the growing dusk. I remained there long after she was gone, wondering what had just transpired, if it meant anything at all, and whether I had just made the biggest mistake or the most important decision of my life. The morning after the kiss, I was awake long before my alarm went off. For the first time in years, the familiar weight on my chest felt lighter, as if something had finally been lifted. I actually felt an eagerness to start the day. I took my time in the shower, shaved carefully, and put on my nicest work shirt. At exactly 9:13, I walked into the daily grind. Clara was behind the counter, just as she always was. But the atmosphere was completely different. She didn't greet me with her usual quiet joke. There was no wry nickname, no smile, just a fleeting glance in my direction. Morning, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Large Earl Grey. She just nodded, turned to prepare it in silence. The easy camaraderie we had built was gone, replaced by a thick, uncomfortable tension. When she handed me the cup, our fingers brushed for a fraction of a second. She recoiled as if burned and immediately turned her attention to the next person in line. I stood there for a moment, hoping she might look back, offer some sign. She never did. I left, the warm cup in my hand doing nothing to stop the cold, sinking feeling in my gut. Throughout the day, I cycled through a dozen possible explanations. Maybe she was just exhausted. Maybe Leo had kept her up all night. Maybe she was just having an off day. But by the time evening rolled around, a more painful truth began to settle in. She regretted it. I didn't want to accept it. That kiss had felt so genuine to me. It wasn't driven by lust or loneliness, but by something honest and true. I was certain she had felt it too. But the look on her face that morning, that wasn't the look of someone who had shared a meaningful moment. It was the look of someone reinforcing her defenses. I gave it a day, then two. The silence was absolute. No texts, no calls, no clever napkin doodles, no more walks by the water. By the third day, the waiting was unbearable. It was a Thursday night. Her shift was scheduled to end at 8. I walked to the bookstore just as she was starting to close up. I stood outside on the damp sidewalk for a minute, my heart pounding, before pushing the door open. There were only a couple of customers left inside. She saw me, and her expression tightened for a split second before becoming carefully neutral. "Hey," I said, approaching the counter. "Can we talk for a minute?" She hesitated, wiping down the espresso machine. "I'm closing in 10. "I can wait," I replied. I took a seat at a small table by the window. My stomach felt like it was tied in knots with every slow tick of the clock on the wall. At 8:07 she slid into the chair across from me, her arms crossed over her chest, her eyes looking tired. She didn't say anything, leaving it to me to begin. "Did I do something wrong?" She blinked, as if surprised by the directness of the question. "No, Marcus, you didn't do anything wrong." "Then why are you shutting me out?" She let out a slow breath and stared down at the tabletop. "I'm not shutting you out," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm protecting myself." I frowned in confusion. "Protecting yourself from me?" She shook her head. "From this, from what this could become." A long silence stretched between us. I liked the kiss, she admitted finally. Probably more than I should have, and that's what terrifies me. "Why?" I asked. "Because my life is already a complete mess. I have a son, Marcus. I have an ex-husband who is making our divorce a living hell. I don't have the space in my life for feelings that make me feel unmoored." I looked down at my hands, every prepared speech I had mentally rehearsed now sounding foolish and inadequate. She leaned forward, her expression earnest. "When I said you were different, that's part of the problem. You're decent, and you're kind." I said, "I'm not asking you for anything complicated. I like being around you." "That's exactly what I'm afraid of," she whispered. The silence that followed wasn't angry or cold. It was just heavy with the weight of unspoken things. I nodded slowly, the understanding dawning on me. "Okay," I said. "Okay, I get it. I don't like it, but I understand." She seemed surprised. "You're not going to argue with me?" I offered a weak smile. I've never been very good at arguing, especially not when I can see that someone is hurting. A sad smile touched her lips. "You're a good man, Marcus." I pushed my chair back and stood up. "Yeah, that seems to be my brand." She stood as well. "Take care of yourself." "You too." I gave her a small, final nod and turned to leave. Just before I reached the door, she called out my name softly. "Wait." I turned back. "I'm not saying never," she said, her voice strained. "I'm just saying, not now." I nodded again, unable to trust my voice, and walked out into the cool night air. That night, I didn't sleep, but it was a different kind of sleeplessness than before. It wasn't the sharp pain of heartbreak. It was a hollow, confusing emptiness. I didn't feel rejected exactly. I felt like I had been put on hold, like a story had begun but the author had left the rest of the pages blank. Over the next few weeks I stayed away from the bookstore, not because I was angry, but because I needed to respect what she had asked for. Not now meant she needed space, and the last thing I wanted to be was another man in her life who ignored her boundaries. I still thought of her every morning. I still caught myself glancing at the clock at 9:15 out of pure habit. I still wondered if she ever thought about me. One evening, I typed out a text message but couldn't bring myself to send it. Every word was true. I'm still here if you ever decide now has arrived. I'm not going anywhere. I saved it to my drafts and put my phone away. Sometimes the most difficult part of caring for someone isn't the rejection, it's the waiting. It had been 26 days since I had last spoken to Clara. I wasn't deliberately counting, but every morning at 9:15 my internal clock would ping with the memory. Every time my work took me past the daily grind, my gaze would involuntarily drift to the front window before I forced myself to look away. I had honored my unspoken promise. I gave her space. No texts, no accidental run-ins, no attempts to check in. But she was a constant presence in my thoughts. Not just the memory of the kiss, but all the small details. The way she would bite her lower lip when she was concentrating. The specific shade of blue in her eyes when she laughed. The way she carried herself with a resilience that seemed both innate and hard-won. I missed her. But even more than that, I missed the feeling of being truly seen by someone who didn't want me to be anyone other than who I was. Then, on a Wednesday evening, the pattern was broken. I arrived home from the workshop around 7, dropped my tool bag by the door, and was in the middle of making a deeply uninspired dinner of scrambled eggs when I heard a soft thud on my doorstep. I turned down the stove, waited a moment, then went to the door and opened it. The hallway was empty. But sitting on my welcome mat was a worn paperback copy of a poetry collection we had once talked about. There was no bag, no wrapping, just the book itself with a slip of paper sticking out from between the pages. I bent down and picked it up, my fingers trembling slightly. There, written in her familiar handwriting on a torn piece of a napkin, were the words, "Still Earl Grey with honey." I stared at it for a long moment, my heart beginning to race. Tucked inside the book was another, more carefully folded note. "If you're still willing to talk, I'll be at our bench by the water this Sunday at sunset." No expectations. No pressure. There was no name, no number, but I didn't need either. A feeling of immense relief washed over me. I hadn't even realized how heavy the weight of the last month had been until that exact second, when it began to lift. The next few days were an exercise in patience. I tried to focus on work, but my concentration was shot. I nearly sanded through the top of a vintage Martin, mixed up 2 client appointments, and found myself staring out the window of the workshop like a character in a low-budget romantic drama. By the time Sunday arrived, I was a bundle of nerves. I got to the park 30 minutes early. Our bench sat under a sprawling maple tree, its wood weathered and grey from years of salt air, a few chips of old green paint still clinging to its edges. I sat down, jammed my hands in my pockets, and tried to control the nervous bouncing of my leg. Sunset was scheduled for 6:12. The minutes ticked by, 6:15, 6:20. I told myself to stay calm. Maybe she was looking for parking. Maybe Leo needed something at the last minute. Then I heard the crunch of footsteps on the gravel path behind me. I turned, and there she was. Clara. Her hair was down, falling over the shoulders of an old, comfortable-looking hoodie. She wore no makeup, just jeans and worn sneakers, and she was carrying that same dented thermos and a small paper bag. She looked exactly as I remembered, and yet somehow entirely new. She walked over, sat down beside me without a word, and offered me the thermos. "I brought tea," she said. "It's probably lukewarm again." "I don't mind," I replied, taking a sip. It was perfect. For a long minute we just sat there, the silence between us feeling like a warm, comforting blanket instead of a barrier. Finally, she broke it. I almost didn't come. I looked over at her. Why did you? She let out a long, slow sigh. Because I couldn't stop thinking about that night. Not about the kiss, about what you said afterwards. What did I say? You said you just liked being around me. That was it. No strings, no agenda. I nodded. She looked out at the darkening water. For years, I've had people trying to fix me, or save me, or treat me like I'm some project they need to complete. You never did that. You just listened. That's all I ever wanted to do, I said honestly. She turned to face me. My ex is back in the picture. Not for me. For Leo, he wants regular visitations now. He's sober, he says. He claims he's trying to be a better father. I remained quiet, letting her speak. She continued, her voice heavy. And then you came along, and I felt something real, and it completely terrified me. I exhaled slowly. Clara, the last thing I ever wanted was to make your life more complicated. I know, she said. And that's what made you so different. Another pause settled between us. She reached into the paper bag she'd brought and pulled out 2 slightly misshapen store-bought cookies. She handed one to me. We ate them in silence. Oatmeal raisin. A little dry, but still good. Then she asked, "Do you still think about that night?" "All the time," I admitted without hesitation. "And if I told you that I'm still not ready for anything serious, but that I wanted to try starting over just much more slowly, would that be okay?" I turned to her. "Are we talking tea at the bookstore slow or bench by the water slow?" She laughed. A real, genuine laugh that made her eyes crinkle at the corners. "Somewhere in between." I nodded then. "Yeah," I said, a smile spreading across my face. "That would be okay." We sat there until the last sliver of sun disappeared behind the Olympic Mountains. We weren't 2 people rushing toward a conclusion, but 2 people quietly agreeing to a beginning. This matters. When we finally stood up to leave, she didn't say goodbye. She just looked at me and said, "I'll see you tomorrow." "Same time?" I asked. "Same time," she confirmed. She walked off toward the parking lot, and I stayed for a minute longer, finishing my tea and looking at the empty bench. For the first time in a month, I didn't feel stuck in limbo. I felt like we were finally moving, slowly, honestly, and together. It has been 10 months since that evening on the park bench. I can recall every detail of it. The sound of her voice, the way her hands were wrapped around that thermos, the look in her eyes when she said, "Somewhere in between." That moment was our true beginning. Not a dramatic confession of love, not a sweeping promise, but a quiet permission to start again. We didn't rush things. That was the most important part. There were no grand declarations, no external pressures. We texted. We talked on the phone. I started visiting the bookstore again, but not with the same rigid daily routine as before. Maybe just a couple of times a week. Sometimes I'd leave her a sketch on a napkin. Sometimes she'd slip me a day-old scone when her boss wasn't looking. In early April, I finally met Leo. He was exactly as she had described him, a small hurricane of boundless energy. He was all gangly limbs and facts about black holes and very strong opinions about broccoli. I was terrified, but Clara made it feel completely natural. I wasn't trying to be a replacement dad. I was just Marcus, the guy who fixed a broken lamp and happened to be surprisingly good at drawing aliens with laser eyes. We started doing small things together as a trio, picnics at the park, trips to the farmer's market, movie nights at her small apartment. The 3 of us would share a big bowl of popcorn, while Leo inevitably fell asleep on the couch halfway through the film. And Clara and I would just sit there in the quiet that followed, too content to speak. We avoided using the word relationship for a long time. Not because we weren't in one, but because giving it a name too early felt like it would make it fragile, like something we could shatter just by saying it aloud. She still had her difficult days. Sometimes a shadow would pass over her, and she would retreat into herself, becoming quiet for hours. One evening I came over to find her sitting on the floor of her bedroom, holding a framed photo of Leo as a toddler. She didn't say much, just, "I really thought my life was going to look so different." I didn't try to fix her sadness or offer platitudes. I just sat on the floor beside her in the quiet. After a while, she leaned her head against my shoulder and whispered, "You make it easier to breathe." That was the night I realized I was in love with her. Not the dizzy, heart-pounding kind of love from movies, but the quiet, steady, earned kind. The kind that doesn't need to shout because it shows up, day after day. In July, the owner of the guitar shop I worked for decided to retire and sell the building. I was laid off. It hit me hard, not just the financial blow, but the emotional one. I felt adrift, like I had nothing stable to offer her. I went quiet for 2 days, too ashamed to text her. On the third day, she showed up at my apartment unannounced, stood in my doorway with her arms crossed, and said, "Don't you dare disappear on me, Marcus. Not after all this." I admitted that I felt like a failure. She just looked at me and said, "Well, I felt like a failure the day I signed my divorce papers, and yet here we are. Neither of us is broken, we're just rebuilding." She helped me update my resume and put me in touch with a friend of hers who was a facilities manager for the local school district. I was hired 2 weeks later. It wasn't my passion, but it was steady, honest work, and it was mine. By the time autumn arrived, we had found our rhythm. Leo started 3rd grade. I found a new apartment, still my own space, but only a 5-minute walk from hers. Some nights I would cook dinner for them. Other nights we'd walk to the library just to browse the shelves and breathe in the smell of old paper. And somewhere in between the home-cooked meals, the spilled juice, and the quiet evenings on her worn-out sofa, Clara's smile began to change. It wasn't the practiced, guarded one she used with customers anymore. This smile was softer, slower to form, but completely real. It was the smile of someone who had finally let her guard down and found it was safe to do so. A month ago, I brought up the idea of us living together. It wasn't a surprise or a grand gesture. We were just having a quiet breakfast. She was buttering toast for Leo. I said, "What would you think about maybe finding a place for the 3 of us?" She didn't look up right away. She just finished making the toast, put it on a plate, and sat down at the table. Then she looked at me and said, "You're the first man I've trusted enough to even consider sharing a home with again. So yeah, let's find a place." We didn't make a big event out of it. We just started looking. We found a small 2-bedroom house on a quiet side street. It had a little fenced-in yard for Leo and a kitchen with atrocious green countertops, but she loved it, so I did too. Today is our first morning in our new home. Leo is still asleep in his room. Clara is curled up on the sofa in one of my old sweatshirts, her feet tucked underneath her as she reads a book. The house smells like coffee and fresh paint. I go and sit beside her. She leans against me without a word. We don't need to fill the silence much anymore. We just know. After a few minutes, I say quietly, "Do you remember what I said to you that first night on the bench?" She smiles without looking up from her book. "You said we shouldn't be doing this." She closes the book, sets it aside, and turns her head to look at me, her eyes soft and clear. "And what did I say?" I grin, feeling the same spark I felt all those months ago. She lifts her hand, gently places her finger on my lips, and whispers, "But we are." I lean in and kiss her. It's different now. Not hesitant, not searching, just sure. When we pull away, she whispers, "Thank you for being so patient. Thank you for waiting for me." I shake my head. "You were never something to be fixed, Clara. I think I was the one who needed something. I just needed someone to believe I was worth showing up for. She holds my gaze, her hand finding mine. You always were, she says. And that's how our story settles. Not with a dramatic crescendo or a picture-perfect ending. Just two people who refused to rush, who brought their scars and their histories and built something honest, who constructed a life together, piece by piece, breath by breath. And now, this is where we live.